It's the week ending Saturday the 20th of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the UK terror threat level raised to severe after a bomb exploded outside a Liverpool hospital, cricketer Azim Rafiq testifying to Parliament on the racism he experienced at Yorkshire County Cricket Club, and Sophie Ellis-Bextor raising £1 million for children in need in a 24-hour dance-a-thon. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kate Samuelson. From daily podcast The Retrospectors, it's Arion McNicoll. And so good last week, we booked him again. He also makes himself available when others drop out. It's Mr. Abdulwahab Tahhan. OK, Arion, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learned that the secret of CEO's success may lie in succession.
Welcome to the real annual meeting. So let's find a deal that works for both of us.
Stewie Hosseini. They want to meet.
What do they know that we don't know?
I mean, does this make sense?
If we go to the vote, we're gonna lose a company today. Is there something that we can work out here?
This is you throwing it away.
I've got the White House on the line. It's the president. It's urgent.
Oh, so good. Arion, please tell me we're going to spend 10 full minutes talking about Season 3, Episode 5 of Succession, because I'm totally here for that.
Yeah, I mean, that clip may not mean very much to anyone who hasn't been keeping up with Succession, but yeah, the most recent episode of this hugely popular HBO show, which, by the way, we'll be tackling without spoilers. Anyway, it addressed the question of what a company does when its talismanic figurehead of a CEO starts to lose their way as they get older and a bit more infirm. And the show, for anyone who hasn't seen it, follows a fictional family that's not dissimilar to the Murdoch clan, and, very like Rupert Murdoch in the real world, the patriarch of the family, who's called Logan Roy, is looking around his children to try to work out who among them is worthy of taking over his massive multinational company when he dies.
Yes, and it's great, but it's not directly related to the news because it is fiction, so why are we talking about it?
Right, so this most recent episode, Season 3, Episode 5, has been building up to this critical shareholder meeting that has hugely high stakes. And again, without revealing anything, Logan Roy's personal qualities, both good and bad, take the company kind of to the brink of, is it going to stay in the family or is it not? And it seemed a pretty neat summary of this really interesting set of questions that were being tackled in the most recent issue of The Economist in an article that was headlined, "Chief Executives Are Weirder Than Ever," which was all about the kind of shifting skill set required to be a CEO in the modern world. And the article started out by noting that celebrity bosses used to have nicknames that kind of made a virtue of their short fuses and brutality, names like Chainsaw Al and Neutron Jack. But increasingly now, they're kind of, the qualities that make a good CEO are some of those old skills, but also increasingly things like inclusivity and empathy. And so that article, like Succession, was looking at how and why the skill set of your chief executives in the modern world are changing.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, Kate, Brian Cox's character in Succession is beginning to look increasingly out of touch with the way that a big media company like that should be run, and so it is in the real world. Changes in the boardroom being led perhaps by Gen Z. There's an expectation amongst younger employees that their boss should be a bit different to the Murdoch-type figure of old.
I think it's really interesting to see how differently younger millennials and members of Gen Z view the workplace. They have completely different values and expectations than older generations. I read a recent report that was cited by Forbes that said something like 83% of younger workers reported that they want to work for an organisation where they can make a positive impact on the world. And 75% said they prioritised a workplace that valued a healthy work-life balance. And clearly, younger generations care very deeply about issues like cultural inclusivity, sustainability, and, as I mentioned, the work-life balance. So to really win the hearts of millennials and Generation Z or Z, however you want to say it, companies and employers need to demonstrate commitments to the greater good and issues like climate change and mental health. And also, really interestingly, according to Deloitte, Gen Z values salary even less than other generations. So if they're given the choice of accepting a better paid but boring job versus work that's more interesting but doesn't pay well, Gen Z is fairly evenly split over the choice. And often this can lead to a bit of a clash in the workplace between younger people who have this mindset and older employees who are used to things being done a particular way. And I think you can see a lot of this in the discourse around returning to the office. There's a bit of a sense among older generations, without wanting to generalise, of a kind of, I was in the office every day from 7 a.m. my whole career, so why should young people have it easy and be working from home? Whereas younger people think, well, if I can do my job just as well from home and have that flexibility, then why not?
I mean, Abdul, you were talking on just last week's show about how your students, you teach at a university in Hong Kong, are preparing to enter the world of work at the moment and why they're looking for jobs where they can speak English, etc. Do they put their ethics to one side when they're applying for jobs from there? Is this a Western preoccupation we're discussing?
Well, there's one thing they wouldn't put aside. It's their phone. So good luck taking their phone away from that. And I think there was a survey that Generation Z said that they would be willing to sacrifice a finger to keep their phone. So no, I don't think we are yet to see that. We are yet to see, but I think Generation Z is going to be just as our generation or the generation before us when it comes to being a CEO. Because there's an article by Harvard Business Review which talks about what makes a good CEO or what makes a CEO. A CEO is actually, they're just workaholic people. They just work nonstop. They work almost 10 hours on daily basis, 79% of their weekend, 4 hours a weekend, and 70% of their vacation times, they spend an average of 2.5 hours. So these are people who are workaholic. They don't care about what you like or what you don't like. They get things done. And if you're Generation Z and you're willing to do that and put in the work, you'll get rewarded with your bank account to be as big as your phone number, I guess.
Yeah, there's a bit of cult of personality, Arion, around CEOs. You know, you think of Zuckerberg, Gates, Musk, you know, these guys that are on the front covers of Fast Company every month. And I wonder to what extent that actually aligns with these new values we're discussing. Like, people still clearly enjoy having something of an eccentric at the helm.
Yes, Musk and Zuckerberg and the like are particular cases in point because not only are they CEOs, but they're also the founders of their companies. And so often I think those kind of founder-owner CEO types have a slightly different sort of skill set because their eccentricity simply has to be tolerated because they're the people who own all of the 100% of the company at the point where it starts up, if not necessarily by the time it's a massive multinational like their companies are today. But I think that, looking at Kate's point about the expectations of Gen Z on your contemporary companies that they might want to work for, I think those do then trickle down to CEOs themselves. And they're expected not only to be able to address these issues of modern concern, gender equality, data security, environmentalism, and so on, but they're also meant to be able to balance those against also running a company that is hugely profitable. And I think also the fact that they're so very much in the spotlight, they're accountable not only in the media but also across social media, means that they have to perform in a way that makes them personable. And it is a test that Musk and Zuckerberg don't always pass. They can come across, both of them, as a little bit robotic. But your average CEO of a sort of Coca-Cola or an IBM or whatever, they do tend to have those sort of softer touch skills. And I think that's the sort of stuff that The Economist wants to focus on.
If I could come in here very quickly, and I would say that, yes, there have been some changes, that these people do some changes for their companies because that makes them more profitable. For example, saying that we are now environmentally friendly. It's because the new generation likes that. They say now we are big on diversity. Well, they're not really big on diversity in the decision room, but they're big on diversity in the lower grades, in the lower pay grades. So these are just things to tick the boxes and for the company to look better because this makes it more profitable. So I don't think there's an actual change in here, but a change that makes the company better in the media and makes the company better for the next generation.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that Succession points at as well, isn't it, Kate? That, you may have to present the company as moving in new directions, but in charge, you've still got the gerontocracy.
That's definitely true. And in the recent the most recent episode, the one that we've been talking about, you can see that it's these kind of two patriarchs of various companies who are the ones that are calling all the shots. Although I do think it's worth pointing out that at the end of the day, without wanting to, give spoilers away, the decision making does come down to Shiv and to Sandy with an I, two of the female characters. And they're actually the ones that are making the decisions and pulling the strings, even if they're in some ways making their fathers feel like they are the ones pulling the strings. I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the main writers on Succession are women and you have such strong female characters. But I think this also does suggest that there's a bit of a shift. And actually, I know that female leaders are really underrepresented in the workforce, especially at that top level. But we are seeing that more. And I think having these savvy, ambitious characters that are pulling the strings is a really amazing representation to see.
Yeah, but pulling the strings from the middle rungs, Arion. I mean, Succession portrays it as fast, but this problem of old white men leading large institutions that they're out of touch with is endemic across various corporations. And some of them don't have to be cool and touchy-feely because, they're selling oil or they're in construction or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that there are twin pressures applied to CEOs that are leading this change. And one is what we've been talking about, those external pressures coming from, customers or stakeholders or shareholders who want companies to change to reflect the sort of ethics of the day. But increasingly also, and this was one of the things that the Economist article identified, was research by Stephen Hansen of the Imperial College in London, which found that the rise of knowledge workers, those people whose job it is to think for a living, means that increasingly more and more firms depend on their developers, their data scientists, their IT managers and the like, who are used to both operating independently of the people above them because their work is quite siloed, but also it's so technical that a CEO is no longer expected to be able to understand the stuff that all of those people within their company do. So no longer are they telling them what to do, but they're kind of trying to guide them to work effectively together. And again, this underlines this new sort of skill set of interpersonal ability being more important than just the kind of hard-headed railroading of people into doing what you tell them.
But I mean, Abdul, we've all worked for belligerent, difficult people who think they know right, but the people who manage to keep their jobs, sadly, often they do know right. And that is why they're able to keep their jobs, is ultimately their business decisions are sound. And maybe you get in a position that's difficult if your CEO is treading on eggshells when you actually need someone, the decision maker, to be quite firm.
I think one of the biggest traits of being a CEO is that they're not agreeable people. They don't really care being likable or not. I know this is a little bit of a far-fetch, but Rafael Nadal's coach was his uncle. And in his memoir, that his uncle was very tough on him and he would shout at him. And nowadays, coaches can't be that tough, can't shout. They're a little bit soft. They kind of try to play with the kids, try to take them for ice cream and treat after that. We don't see that back in the days. I don't know if we're going to see another Nadal or another Federer, or maybe because of that, but I highly suspect that.
Kate, has Holden ever taken you for an ice cream? And if he hasn't, is it prohibiting your chances of being the Nadal of journalism?
Ollie, I just don't know how to answer that. What I will say is, I do think we've seen a bit of a shift during the pandemic. And I think a lot of these big CEOs have had to take on a sense of compassion that perhaps was missing beforehand, before the pandemic. And I think, times of crisis really require leaders to step up and be leaders. It's not enough to just be a manager and just be continuing as business as usual. I think that CEOs have had to take on board things like considering what the mental health of their employees is like and working out what they can do to make situations better for people, by offering bonuses or extra time off or generally being a bit more flexible in terms of working hours. And actually studies do show that when employee well-being suffers, so does organisational productivity and performance. So it does make good business sense. So there really has been a bit of this shift from being just the kind of Logan-esque raving CEO shouting at people to actually being a bit more compassionate while at the same time as being ruthless. And I think that's really interesting.
Well, there you are. You swerved my question expertly and answered the one you wanted to. Your boss would be proud.
I am a journalist after all.
Abdul, I'll be coming to you next after this. Okay, Abdul, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Iran goalkeeper didn't have any balls.
In 2015, the Iranian women's national football team was reported to include several transgender women who had not undergone gender reassignment surgery. In fact, Iran reportedly performs the second highest number of gender reassignment surgeries in the world, despite being a strict Muslim nation. So why would a country that demonizes homosexuality be such a proponent of gender reassignment surgery?
Gabby Dunn on Test Tube News from Now This World. That was back in 2015, Abdul, but it hints at what's been happening this week. Tell us the story.
Oh, this is huge in Arabic media. It was like buzzing, Twitter, news, everywhere. So the Iran women football team was playing Jordan in qualifying for the 2022 Asian Cup, and Iran won in a shootout 4-2. There were a lot of photos of the Iranian goalkeeper who had a masculine features. And then the Jordanian Football Association tweeted that they want an investigation about the gender of this goalkeeper.
Yes, and didn't just tweet about it, but tweeted an attached formal letter to the relevant FA saying we want an investigation.
That's true, because that letter includes Article 47, citing that while it is not mandatory for the FA to check the gender or to test the gender of the players, but they have all the right to investigate if there's any suspicion. So the Jordanian Football Association was just exercising their right that they suspect that this is not a female. And there's a background for this. In 2015, there was an article and suspect that 8 players in the women's football team were actually men, not women. It turned out that they haven't gone through this gender reassignment surgery yet.
Yeah, so goodness, we've opened a can of worms here, Kate, because obviously, there's different terminology for whether someone can self-identify, whether gender reassignment is what qualifies you to say you are of a transition gender, etc., etc. And it's something the world is feeling around, not least the world of sport. But in Iran, it seems to be the case that it is quite clear-cut, actually. You become a woman if you were born as a man when you have gender reassignment surgery. They don't accept a definition of I'm presenting as a woman. And so it could be damaging for them, couldn't it, if it turned out their women's football team was formed of people that hadn't had gender reassignment surgery and still had the genitals they were born with.
Yeah, I find this whole conversation, not necessarily on this podcast, but in the media right now, it just has quite a nasty edge to it. I don't feel very comfortable hypothesising over someone's gender in this way. And this football player, she says she's a woman, so it feels like we should believe her. And if she's a transgender woman, again, I feel like we should be seeing her as a valued and valid member of this team. I think it's worth noting that there's very little evidence to show that transgender athletes actually have an unfair advantage, which is what the conversation's about.
Yes. Well, but it doesn't, for people who are looking for examples where they think transgendered athletes, if that's what these women are, do have an unfair advantage, this would be the poster child, though, wouldn't it? Because, as Abdul was saying, you can look at the history of the Iranian women's football team and say there may have been years where the majority of the team were made up of people who are biologically born male. So that does seem like an unfair advantage, doesn't it? It's not like 1 or 2 people in the team.
No, you're right. And Abdul was reciting this story that broke in 2015, which said that up to 8 players in the team were alleged to be men awaiting their gender reassignment operations. But I think it's worth pointing out that at no point has anyone been found guilty of any offences related to these accusations. Well, that's my understanding at least. I think the way it's being written about as if she's got a kind of ulterior motive to take advantage of a flaw in the system and to play in the women's team without a kind of sincere desire to be a woman. If that's true, that does make me uncomfortable. But I think the thing that makes me feel most uncomfortable is that and also obviously there's a big if here because all of this is just us hypothesizing. It's just that she might be taking the place of an Iranian woman on the team and robbing her of her opportunity to play for her country. But it just seems so hypothetical right now.
According to the Arabic news media, so the Asian Football Confederation confirmed that she is a female, but didn't go into details about the background of their investigation.
But I mean, I take Kate's point that you know, as she says, hypothesizing feels unpleasant, but unless you go into details, it is a bit unclear what the rules are, isn't it, Arion? And the International Olympics Committee this week released new guidelines themselves on trans athletes. What have they now said?
Well, so this takes us quite a long way back to the first mandatory sex tests, which were issued by the International Association of Athletics Federations back in 1966, when they began, first of all, checking athletes for their gender by simply looking at them. They had this horrific sounding thing called a nudity parade, where they literally checked their bodies to test whether they were male or female. But that only lasted a year, and then from 1967 until 2011, athletes were tested according to their chromosomes, but that also fell out of favour. And then more recently, from 2011 onwards, what the tests were, at least according to the IAAF and in the International Olympic Committee, they were testing for testosterone levels. And originally, the IAAF limited female athletes to having 10 nanomoles, which was a measure I wasn't familiar with, per litre of testosterone in their blood. But even this has proven complex and controversial, not least of all in the cases of the Indian sprinter Dutee Chand, who failed the test on the basis of her own natural testosterone levels, and even better known, Caster Semenya from South Africa. And both of them were given the choice of either taking drugs to limit their testosterone levels or, frankly, not compete. But just this week, the International Olympic Committee has announced a whole new framework, which seems to be responding to the pressures of the UN and the World Medical Association and independent campaigners, basically saying that none of these frameworks work well to determine the categories of men and women that have traditionally dominated sports. And the International Committee now has this new framework, which is called On Fairness, Inclusion and Non-Discrimination on the Basis of Gender Identity and Sex Variation.
And it goes on for pages. I read it this morning, and it's quite, after all that apparent clarity, it's quite hard to determine what it is they've decided. Like, it used to be
I agree.
blunt, didn't it? Like too blunt.
Yes. Yeah,
genital surgery
exactly.
or testosterone levels. Now they're saying that's not fair. It's more complex. Yes, but then it's very hard to have a rule, isn't it?
Exactly. And the way that it was reported was as if it was directed at trans and intersex people, but I think it's actually more applicable to that, at least from my early digesting of it, and I must confess I've only just started looking at it myself. But I think that it is trying to find a less hard and fast way to determine who should compete in men's and women's sports than the old way, which has been since 2011, of looking at their testosterone levels.
But whilst the IOC are tying themselves in knots about this in an attempt to be clear, Abdul, in the Arabic media that you're reading, is the understanding more in line with the IOC's position before 2015, i.e. a transgender athlete has to have genital surgery to say that they are a different sex to the one they were born with, and that's the view of most people in the Arab world?
That's pretty much the view of the majority of the people that I've seen on Twitter, they've seen on the news, that everyone was taking the mickey out of this player, that they're accusing her of being a male. However, which is very interesting, a few women and feminists who are the minority on Twitter started, a campaign to support her and say that she's now being bullied. This player is being bullied because of the way she looks, and we've known this for a long, long time, and this is completely unacceptable. However, yes, she has been bullied. I totally see that, but on the ground that the Football Confederation allows, they have an article says that if there is suspicion, then we are allowed to investigate. So if the Confederation wants to protect players, they should not allow this to happen in the first place.
And yet, Kate, I mean, the more simpler, progressive way of looking at it would be simply to say if you identify as a woman, you're a woman.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a very heated debate what makes a woman. It's one of the most contentious topics, definitely in the UK media at the moment. And I think it's just worth remembering that Iran has got quite progressive gender identity laws in some ways, but it's still extremely difficult to be a transgender person there. I mean, of course, homosexuality is punishable by death. I'm not calling it a liberal country. It's an extremely conservative country. And actually the fact that trans rights are recognised, that comes more down to the country seeing transgender people as having a medical illness with a cure, which is the sex reassignment surgery, rather than being deviant, which is how gay people are thought of. But it's by no means an easy place to be transgender. I was shocked to read on Quartz that some gay people in Iran end up undergoing gender reassignment surgery because of the death penalty towards homosexuality. And according to The Economist, therapists in Iran actually tell patients with same-sex desires that they may be transgender, not gay. So it's not a matter of it being easy for people to change gender in Iran and then using that sort of loophole to work the system when it comes to sport. It's really important to make it clear that when you're gay or transgender or a woman in Iran, life is incredibly difficult.
I think one thing that is certainly clear-cut was the response from the Iran team's head coach, Mariam Irandust, who said that these allegations are really just an excuse not to accept the defeat against the Iranian women's national team. And basically she said, this is just sour grapes. The Jordanians were deeply favoured to qualify and they didn't qualify. And when they lost, they were trying to look around for excuses for why they didn't make it through. And I think sadly, they've created this quite damaging accusation, not only for the goalkeeper in question, Zahra, but also for more broadly women in sport in general. So I think that it's a shame in a way that all of that has come tangled up into a story which was really just, the Iranian team, fair and square, beating the Jordanian team.
Abdul, what do you think the significance of this moment is?
The significance of this moment is that there is now a debate, at least in Arabic media, about this. While it is totally outdated. Totally, the terms used are not, PC at all. They're not that terms you would use in English language. But at least there's a debate in the Arabic media. This is a very big topic. I think there is going to be more awareness of transgender athletes and hopefully more inclusion for them. But there should be more protection from this organization. And maybe this starts with the CEOs.
And does that discussion include the elephant in the room that Kate mentioned there, which we have discussed on the show before, but perhaps isn't widely known, that gender assignment surgery is relatively popular and frequent in Iran, I think second only to Thailand globally, because basically homosexuality is illegal. So a lot of people fearing death choose to live as the opposite sex.
A couple of years ago, the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, in a press conference, he said, we don't have any homosexuals in Iran. We don't have gay. Everyone has a gender reassignment surgery. So this is very, very popular. This is one of the biggest country in the Middle East for nose job and now for gender reassignment surgery.
So is that part of this discussion that you're seeing in the Arabic media, that people are pointing out that this is obviously a bit suspicious?
Oh, no, not at all. Everyone is just talking about Iran, talking about the sports, inclusion of women in the sports, inclusion of transsexual in the sports, because this is a taboo to talk about in Arabic media. This is a taboo topic that transgender are competing, are being seen as a normal thing.
But what about homosexuals that have transitioned sex because they can't live as homosexuals? Is that part of the discussion, or is that still taboo as well?
That is not part of this the conversation at all.
Okay.
Because there are no gays in Iran.
Okay, Kate, you'll be finishing the show after this. Kate, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The Me Too movement, tennis, and Chinese censorship colliding.
35-year-old Peng Shuai is a tennis star. She's reached as high as 14th in women's singles rankings and was once the world's #1 ranked doubles player.
I love tennis and I just want to be happy on the court.
And since the start of the month, she has vanished.
YouTube channel The Project reporting on Wednesday. Kate, tell us a little about Peng Shuai and what's happened this week.
So concerns have been growing for Peng Shuai, who's a former number one ranked tennis doubles player and one of China's most famous athletes. The 35-year-old hasn't been publicly seen since the 2nd of November, when she wrote a now viral post on her verified account on the Chinese social media platform Weibo. The post alleged that a former Chinese vice premier called Zhang Gaoli coerced her into sex and that they later had an on and off sexual relationship. Zhang, who's 75, was a close ally of the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. And Peng Shuai's post was deleted about half an hour after it was posted, and searches of her name appeared to be blocked in China, as well as searches for the word tennis, but that was just temporary. But now it's been more than 2 weeks and she still hasn't been seen in public, and concerns have been growing for her safety, with major figures in the sporting world like Naomi Osaka and Novak Djokovic publicly voicing their concerns. And then early this morning UK time, I suppose I should say that we're recording this on Thursday, an email was shared by an arm of Chinese state media on Twitter, which they claimed was from Peng, saying that everything was fine, the allegations are false, and that she's been resting at home.
And that's only increased suspicions.
Exactly. The email kind of, the way it was written, it sounded almost like a bot. You could see a cursor on it. There are a few things that have led to doubts about its authenticity.
So this does have an echo then of what happened with Jack Ma, the guy who founded Alibaba, which we talked about on the show earlier this year. He also was sort of disappeared, wasn't he? Having been very, very prominent as a media figure, then seemed to no longer be active suddenly, having said something that the government didn't approve of.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, as you said, Jack Ma, who's the billionaire behind the tech giant Alibaba, he went missing for 3 months in November last year. And the month before, he'd made a controversial speech that criticised the Chinese financial system and said that it operated with a pawn shop mentality. And then in January this year, he eventually resurfaced, but he's kept a really low profile ever since. But that's just one example of that. You know, these disappearances have hit Chinese Hollywood too. In August this year, Zhao Wei, who's widely considered to be one of the most popular actresses in China, she's also the face of the Italian fashion house Fendi. She disappeared from Chinese social media with her name scrubbed from the credits of films and TV shows. Similarly, the internationally renowned Chinese actress Fan Bingbing, she mysteriously disappeared from the public eye for 4 months in 2018, and she's kept a relatively low profile since.
And the suspicion is, Arion, that behind the scenes what's going on, because these are high-profile celebrities, you know, these aren't people who are going to be locked up in prison forever without people noticing. But the suspicion is that something a bit like the re-education, in quotes, that we've seen around the Uyghurs is what's going on, that there's a sort of government indoctrination. No, you've got the wrong opinions. These are the right opinions.
Yeah, and the advocacy group, the Chinese Human Rights Watch defenders, said in a statement that, at least in the case of Peng Shuai, her statement that she was A-OK should not be taken at face value, not least because of all of these other disappearances that have happened prior to her. And they went on, until Peng Shuai is free, the burden of proof should be on the Chinese government to prove that she isn't detained. And that sort of seems fair in a way, because you're like, okay, fine, you can release a statement, but how about we actually see this person and then we will believe you? And I suppose, you know, much as the stakes are high from the perspective of the person who's gone missing, I think one of the reasons why the accusation from Peng was such big news was because Zhang himself is a hugely important figure within China, and he'd be the highest ranking government official ever to be charged with sexual misconduct if it went that way and he was charged for what she has alleged. You know, he was a close confidant of Xi Jinping. He's recently stood down as vice premier of China, or comparatively recently, but he also oversaw the Three Gorges Dam project and the North-South Water Transfer project, these massive infrastructure projects of China's, and was in charge of the leading group for the One Belt, One Road plan, which was considered really the centerpiece of Xi Jinping's foreign policy. So, you know, he himself is a big name, and so you can almost understand why the accusation has led to this extreme response from a state that is known to have extreme responses.
But also the context is important, isn't it, Abdul? Because this was about a coercive sexual relationship being alleged, and therefore could have prompted pretty much the most high-profile Me Too episode in China Is it possible to have a Me Too movement in China, or would this just happen all the time?
Well, as you said, we need to take this into context. And one of the most important things that I've seen really missing from a lot of coverage in Western media is that this letter or this post was all in Chinese. And most those who reported on it did not really read it in Chinese.
I think whatever was lost in translation, Abdul, one thing that was pretty clear was that Peng Shui's allegation was that she had been raped. And yes, she said that she had had a relationship with him prior to this event more recently, but she said that having had this relationship and having had it end more recently, she'd been summoned to his house, she'd gone over there, and he had sexually assaulted her while she said someone stood guard. So for whatever didn't make it into the Western media, I think that was the crux of the allegation that both maybe got her post taken down and maybe had her disappeared, and is the reason why we're talking about her today.
My point here for me from all of this story is that we cannot really make anyone who fall out of favor from the government an icon. And we've been doing this so many times. We've done it with Ai Weiwei, who was working heavily and who was one of the favorite of the Chinese government, who was involved in designing the bird nest stadium in Beijing. And then when he came out of favor, we made him an icon.
Okay, but she's not like any of those people. She's not like those because she wasn't working for the government. She was a tennis player. I mean, what she's saying is she had an affair with someone in government. That's her only connection to the government. There's no hypocrisy of her turning around and, she used to accept their dollar and now she doesn't.
No, not at all. But she was having an off and on relationship with someone in the government. They wanted to get married and then they didn't get married.
Well, why was it deleted from Weibo then?
This is why deleted from Weibo is really concerning because, again, I'm not here. Please don't take my words as I'm pro-censorship. I am not pro-censorship. However, Weibo is pretty much monitored, and we know that very, very well. But the positive out of this story, we can see, even though there's no positivity, but hear me out, is that big tech companies can, if they want, take down content. If they want to fight, for example, racism in England, they can do it. If these big tech companies in China can take any content down within a few minutes, even though they're on the wrong side, then any big tech companies can do the same.
But we're still talking about it. We still knew that it happened. So the post still gets shared anyway through screen grabs and stuff. It just leaves you with this lingering perception that something sinister is happening.
But that was outside China.
Yeah, right. So what do you think in China there is no lingering perception that something suspicious is happening? Do you think they buy the argument that she's changed her mind? She was wrong to say it was a problematic relationship or it wasn't true, even though she posted it herself?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to. So I've talked to some people and they told me that, this was just a gossip. We don't really buy it. Some people totally believe her story and they think that she's been taken. And she's behind bars or somewhere, God knows where. So it depends who you're talking to.
I mean, Kate, to answer the question that I put to Abdul, it seems to me like the answer is no, you can't have a Me Too movement in China because this is what will happen. If you name someone who's got influence and who's important and say that they harassed you or abused you or in some way demean their position, that information will not be allowed to spread.
I think it would be more correct to say that it's difficult to have a Me Too movement rather than impossible. And I also think it's worth noting that China has had a Me Too movement, albeit later than the rest of the world. But in 2018, an academic at a really prestigious Beijing university said that she'd been sexually harassed by one of her professors, and that went viral. That was widely considered the start of China's Me Too movement, and her Weibo post gained 3 million views within a day, and the university suspended that professor. So yeah, there definitely have been cases like that in China.
But notably not involving the government.
Yeah, that's
until
true.
now.
That is true. And, the point about censorship is right. As soon as the Me Too movement gained traction, authorities have been censoring online discussions of such cases. But Weibo users are savvy and activists and people who are concerned about women's rights in China, they've found ways to get around it. I read on the BBC that some Weibo users use the words for rice and rabbit in order to talk about the Me Too movement because the Chinese words for rice and rabbit are pronounced like Me Too. There are ways that people are getting around the censorship and still having these conversations.
It's worth noting as well that even though a lot of the individual cases that were part of this kind of spluttering, slightly fledgling Me Too movement that occurred in China. Many of them just got snuffed out in the court system. But last year, legislation was passed by the National People's Congress that for the first time defines actions that can constitute sexual harassment. And prior to that, really, sexual harassment hadn't been a legal offence. And so even though it was a bit of a symbolic step because it didn't actually lay out guidelines for enforcement, it actually was seen as an achievement of the Me Too movement itself, even though, again, it needs to go further and those individual cases could do with having proper justice served to them as well.
Kate, finally on this, I mean, it has been an under-the-radar story this week, in Britain at least, but do you think, I mean, I get the sense that it's snowballing now. Do you think we're going to be talking about this and actually, because there's this natural network of tennis stars who are tweeting about this and putting statuses on Instagram and things, this will be unavoidable soon?
Yeah, I do think it's unavoidable. I think people are demanding answers. The Women's Tennis Association has been calling for a full, fair and transparent investigation into Peng's allegations, as well as an end to any censorship against her. And Steve Simon, who I believe is the chief executive of the WTA, the Women's Tennis Association, he said that the organisation would be prepared to not operate in China if that's what it came to. I mean, obviously, taking on China is not easy for any organisation, no matter how big they are, but people are standing up to this and they're saying, no, it's not okay for a woman's voice to be shut down just because those empowered don't like what she's saying.
Well, there you are. You've threaded together all three of our stories there by referencing a CEO who is male in women's sport. So that feels like a good time to end. Thank you to Kate and to Arion and Abdul for serving us three great stories. It's a tennis pun. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found us today via a Spotify playlist, do now tap go to podcast, then tap follow. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.